Jung's warning about empaths wasn't about emotional sensitivity. It was about psychic absorption and why this empathic ability is darker than you think. He documented individuals with what he called archetypal vulnerability, empaths who unconsciously absorbed the shadow material and unconscious projections of everyone around them. Jung's warning was chilling because he found that empaths without proper boundaries become psychological vessels for others' repressed trauma, rage, and archetypal possession, often losing their own identity completely. Today, I'll reveal Jung's darkest warning about empathic absorption and why he believed this sensitivity either destroys your sense of self or transforms you into a conscious alchemist of human shadow. The woman who forgot her own name. A young woman arrived at Jung's office, speaking in voices that weren't her own. She displayed emotions from strangers, wept tears for people she'd never met, and described feeling like a vessel filled with everyone else's pain. Most disturbing, she couldn't remember her own name. What made this case impossible to dismiss? Everything she felt about others proved accurate. Hidden depressions, suppressed rage, unspoken trauma, she absorbed it all with terrifying precision. "I am everyone and no one," she whispered during one session. "I can tell you exactly what hurts inside each person I meet, but I cannot remember what it feels like to be myself." Her empathy had evolved beyond feeling into something Jung would later term unconscious possession. She had become a psychological dumping ground for the collective unconscious projections of everyone around her. The breakthrough revealed her empathic gift began as childhood survival, reading her volatile father's moods to avoid his explosions. But decades of hypervigilance had dissolved the boundaries between self and other so completely that she existed as a collection of absorbed psychological fragments rather than an integrated person. This case exposed Jung's chilling insight. Empaths don't just feel emotions, they unconsciously absorb entire personality fragments, shadow projections, and archetypal material that gradually erases their original identity. The psychic invasion mechanism. Jung uncovered 3 psychological processes that make empaths vulnerable to what he termed boundary dissolution syndrome. Shadow magnetism operates like psychological gravity. Empaths unconsciously attract and absorb the rejected material that others refuse to acknowledge. Jung's research revealed this happens through what he called projective identification. When someone can't tolerate their own rage, shame, or trauma, they unconsciously project it onto the nearest sensitive person. The empath's psyche, lacking proper defenses, automatically accepts this foreign material as authentic personal experience. Jung documented this process in detail. A businessman suppresses his grief about his father's death for 20 years. When he encounters an empath, this unprocessed sorrow leaps across the psychic space between them, like electricity finding the path of least resistance. The empath suddenly feels inexplicably sad, not realizing they're experiencing someone else's unlived emotion. Archetypal hijacking occurs when powerful psychological patterns, the wounded healer, the eternal martyr, the cosmic mother, use empathic sensitivity as an entry point. Jung tracked how these ancient forces gradually replace the empath's authentic personality with compulsive rescue patterns. He noted that archetypal possession often begins subtly. An empath feels called to help someone, experiences unusual energy around healing work, or develops obsessive thoughts about saving others. The hijacking accelerates when empaths mistake archetypal compulsions for their authentic desires. Jung wrote, "The wounded healer whispers, 'Your pain has meaning only when it serves others,' and the empath, desperate for purpose, surrenders their will to this ancient pattern without recognizing they've been possessed." Identity liquefaction represents the final stage where chronic absorption completely dissolves the empath's original self. Jung observed this phenomenon in advanced cases where empaths could no longer distinguish their own emotional states from absorbed material. They lose access to their own feelings, needs, and desires, becoming instead a composite of everyone they've encountered. He documented the progressive stages. First, empaths lose clarity about their preferences and opinions. Then their emotional responses become inconsistent and confusing. Finally, their sense of self becomes so fragmented that they exist as walking collections of other people's psychological fragments. Jung wrote, "The empath becomes a psychological cemetery, housing the unlived lives and unfelt feelings of others while their own soul withers from neglect." The unconscious predator pattern. But Jung's most disturbing discovery wasn't about empaths themselves. It was about how damaged people unconsciously hunt them. He documented a systematic exploitation pattern that operates entirely below conscious awareness. Narcissists, emotional vampires, and psychologically underdeveloped individuals develop an uncanny ability to locate empaths in any social setting. These psychological predators don't consciously plan their attacks. Instead, they're driven by what Jung called shadow hunger, an unconscious compulsion to find someone who will absorb their emotional waste without complaint. The manipulation tactics are sophisticated yet instinctive, presenting themselves as uniquely wounded souls who need the empath's special understanding, triggering rescue addiction through carefully crafted vulnerability displays, and creating trauma bonds that make the empath feel responsible for the predator's emotional stability. Most insidiously, these individuals become addicted to empath's energy, using their sensitivity as an external emotional regulation system. They learn to dump their psychological garbage and immediately feel better, while the empath becomes increasingly depleted and confused. Jung's patient files reveal the cruel irony. Empath's greatest gift becomes their primary vulnerability. Their capacity for healing attracts those who prefer to remain broken, using empathic energy to avoid doing their own psychological development work. 4 stages of empathic destruction. Jung traced distinct phases of empathic deterioration, each representing deeper levels of identity erosion and shadow contamination. The overwhelmed innocent. Stage 1. Empaths feel everything but understand nothing. Crowds drain them, social interactions exhaust them, and emotions seem to come from nowhere. They often develop anxiety, depression, or chronic fatigue while remaining completely unaware they're carrying others' psychological debris. Jung noted these empaths typically blame themselves for their sensitivity, believing they're too emotional or mentally weak. They haven't yet discovered that their overwhelming feelings often originate from other people's unprocessed material. A classic example from Jung's files: a young teacher who developed panic attacks every time she entered her classroom, not realizing she was absorbing the collective anxiety of 30 stressed students. The compulsive fixer, stage 2 empaths have discovered their purpose, rescuing broken people. They become addicted to being needed, mistaking codependency for love and manipulation for genuine vulnerability. Their identity depends entirely on others' problems. Jung observed that these empaths develop what he called savior syndrome. They can only feel valuable when solving someone else's crisis. They unconsciously seek out damaged individuals and broken situations, not from genuine compassion, but from psychological compulsion. Their relationships follow predictable patterns: intense connection with wounded people, followed by exhaustion when the helped person either recovers and no longer needs them, or refuses to change, rejecting their rescue attempts. The spiritual martyr. Stage 3 empaths use spiritual concepts to justify their self-destruction. They frame boundary violations as unconditional love and emotional exhaustion as serving humanity, refusing to acknowledge that their empathy has become pathological. Jung warned that this stage is particularly dangerous Because empaths develop sophisticated rationalizations for their suffering. They believe their pain serves a higher purpose, that they're light workers meant to absorb darkness from the world. This spiritual bypassing makes them resistant to healing, since recovery would threaten their identity as noble sufferers. The identity ghost. Stage 4 represents complete psychological dissolution. These empaths have absorbed so much foreign material that no authentic self remains. They exist as walking collections of other people's emotions, memories, and personality fragments. Jung documented cases where empaths at this stage would speak in different voices during therapy sessions, display emotions that contradicted their circumstances, and describe feeling like empty vessels filled with strangers. One patient told him, "I am a collection of everyone I've tried to save, but I cannot find the person who started this collection." The progression isn't inevitable, but Jung warned that without conscious intervention, empaths naturally slide toward complete identity annihilation. Each stage represents the psyche's attempt to cope with overwhelming absorption, but also deepens the empath's disconnection from their authentic self. Why it's deadly. The absorption crisis. Jung's research revealed why empathic sensitivity becomes psychologically lethal when left unconscious. Personality fragmentation occurs as empaths unconsciously collect psychological fragments from everyone they encounter. Their original self becomes buried under layers of absorbed material until they can no longer access their authentic feelings, preferences, or memories. Jung documented how this fragmentation progresses. Empaths first lose clarity about their own opinions, agreeing with whoever they're speaking to, because they can't distinguish their authentic views from absorbed perspectives. Next, their emotional responses become unpredictable. They might laugh at funerals and cry during celebrations, responding to psychic material rather than actual circumstances. Finally, their decision-making capacity deteriorates as they can no longer identify what they genuinely want versus what others want from them. Vicarious trauma accumulation creates what Jung called inherited PTSD. Empaths develop trauma symptoms from experiences that never happened to them. They carry the wounds of parents, partners, friends, and even strangers, creating psychological damage that seems to have no source. Jung treated a woman who suffered recurring nightmares about World War I trenches, despite being born decades after the war ended. Investigation revealed she had unconsciously absorbed these images from her grandfather's unprocessed combat trauma. She experienced full PTSD symptoms, hypervigilance, panic attacks, emotional numbing, from memories that weren't her own. Archetypal possession crisis represents the most dangerous phase. Powerful psychological patterns like the wounded healer completely override the empath's conscious personality. They become convinced their purpose is to suffer for others' healing, making them resistant to recovery or boundary development. Jung observed that possessed empaths develop what he called sacred suffering syndrome. They believe their pain serves cosmic purposes, and that healing themselves would be selfish or spiritually regressive. This makes traditional therapy ineffective, since the empath's identity depends on maintaining their wound. Reality distortion syndrome emerges when empaths lose the ability to distinguish their own psychological material from absorbed projections. They live in a confusing blend of authentic and foreign experiences, never knowing which thoughts, feelings, or memories actually belong to them. Jung documented cases where empaths became completely unable to function in daily life, overwhelmed by psychological material they couldn't identify, process, or release. One patient described it as living in a house where all the rooms belong to different people, but I can't remember which room is mine. Jung's boundary alchemy method. Rather than eliminating empathic sensitivity, Jung developed techniques for transforming unconscious absorption into conscious perception. The archaeological dig process involves systematically excavating the empath's authentic self from beneath layers of absorbed material. This requires identifying which emotions, beliefs, and characteristics actually belong to them, versus what they've unconsciously collected from others. Jung developed specific protocols for this excavation. Empaths must track their emotional states throughout the day, noting when feelings arise and what circumstances trigger them. They ask, does this emotion match my actual life situation? When did I first feel this way? Who was I with when it started? This detective work often reveals that many of their strongest emotions originated from other people's unprocessed material. The process involves what Jung called emotional archaeology, carefully separating authentic feelings from absorbed projections layer by layer, like uncovering artifacts from different historical periods. Some emotions belong to childhood experiences, others to recent interactions, and many don't belong to the empath at all. Shadow sorting protocols teach empaths to track emotional states in real time, asking, when did this feeling arise? Who was I with? Does this match my actual life circumstances? This develops what Jung called psychic forensics, the ability to trace foreign material back to its source. Jung instructed empaths to maintain detailed emotional journals, documenting not just feelings, but their origins and contexts. Over time, patterns emerge. Certain people consistently trigger specific emotions. Particular environments create predictable responses, and many overwhelming feelings can be traced to external sources rather than internal experiences. The sorting process becomes increasingly sophisticated as empaths learn to distinguish between different types of foreign material: inherited family trauma, projected partner emotions, absorbed crowd energy, and archetypal possession. Each requires different clearing techniques. Archetypal negotiation techniques use active imagination to establish conscious relationship with possessing forces. Instead of being unconsciously controlled by the wounded healer archetype, empaths learn to dialogue with it, setting terms for when and how they'll engage in healing work. Jung taught empaths to visualize these archetypal forces as distinct entities they could communicate with directly. The wounded healer might appear as an ancient medicine woman who demands constant sacrifice. Through conscious dialogue, empaths can negotiate, I will serve healing, but not at the cost of my own well-being. I will help others, but I won't carry their pain as my own. This transforms archetypal energy from invasive force into collaborative ally. The archetype gets to express its healing purpose, while the empath maintains sovereignty over how and when to engage its power. Energetic container construction involves building what Jung termed permeable but selective membranes, boundaries that can feel and respond without becoming contaminated. This allows empaths to witness suffering without absorbing it into their own energy field. Jung developed visualization exercises where empaths imagine themselves surrounded by a semi-permeable membrane that allows love and compassion to flow while filtering out toxic emotional material. This boundary becomes more sophisticated with practice, eventually operating automatically to protect the empath's psychological integrity. The goal isn't emotional numbness, but what Jung called conscious empathy, the ability to feel with others while maintaining complete psychological sovereignty. Empaths learn to be moved by others' pain without being moved off their own center. Historical case studies, destruction versus mastery. Jung's analysis of historical figures reveals the stark difference between empaths destroyed by absorption and those who achieved conscious mastery. Absorption. Casualty. Virginia Woolf. Woolf's letters and diaries reveal classic empathic absorption patterns. She absorbed the psychological darkness of her social circle, her family's unprocessed trauma, and what she called the cotton wool of existence, the collective emotional numbness of post-war society. Her empathy became a conduit for destructive forces she couldn't identify or control. She wrote of feeling like a recording consciousness that absorbed everything but belonged to nothing, ultimately leading to her psychological collapse. Integration master Maya Angelou. Angelou demonstrated conscious empathy through her ability to witness and transform collective trauma without being destroyed by it. Her autobiographical works show someone who felt deeply for human suffering while maintaining clear identity boundaries. She developed what Jung would recognize as alchemical empathy, the ability to transform pain into wisdom, both for herself and others, without losing her authentic self in the process. The integration difference. Successful empaths maintain professional structures for their sensitivity, develop daily practices for clearing absorbed material, and build support systems that understand their unique psychological needs. They serve healing from strength rather than sacrifice. Failed empaths lack these protections, gradually dissolving into the collective emotional field until no authentic self remains to guide their choices or protect their psychological integrity. Building empath sanctuaries. Jung recognized that empaths require specialized community support to develop healthy boundaries and avoid the isolation that makes them vulnerable to predation. Recognition signals for healthy empath allies include understanding of energy dynamics without spiritual bypassing, balance between compassion and self-protection, and ability to discuss psychological boundaries without dismissing empathic sensitivity. Jung taught empaths to look for specific behavioral markers in potential allies. Do they respect no without argument? Can they discuss emotions without becoming overwhelmed or dismissive? Do they maintain their own boundaries while supporting others? Do they understand the difference between empathy and absorption? Healthy companions demonstrate what Jung called integrated sensitivity. They feel deeply but don't lose themselves in others' experiences. They can witness pain without rushing to fix it, offer support without becoming enmeshed, and maintain their own emotional center even in chaos. Predator warning signs appear in individuals who immediately dump emotional material on new empaths, resist empaths' attempts to establish boundaries, or use guilt and manipulation to maintain access to empathic energy. Jung identified specific predatory patterns: emotional vampires who feel dramatically better after interactions with empaths while leaving them drained, trauma dumpers who share intimate details within minutes of meeting, boundary pushers who ignore no and persist despite clear resistance, guilt manipulators who frame empath self-care as selfishness or abandonment. Most dangerous are the sophisticated predators who understand empathic psychology and deliberately exploit it. These individuals study empaths' patterns, learn their triggers, and craft their approaches accordingly. They present themselves as wounded souls who need the empath's unique understanding, triggering rescue compulsions through carefully orchestrated vulnerability displays. Sacred space. Creation involves finding or building communities that honor empathic gifts while encouraging psychological development. These spaces validate sensitivity without enabling self-destruction, supporting both service to others and fierce self-protection. Jung emphasized that empaths need communities that understand their unique psychological needs, regular solitude for processing absorbed material, validation of their sensitivity without pressure to fix everyone, support for boundary development without judgment about closing their hearts, and practical guidance for managing empathic overwhelm. Healthy empath communities operate on principles Jung called conscious compassion, deep caring coupled with clear boundaries, emotional support without enabling unhealthy patterns, and shared commitment to individual development alongside mutual aid. Jung warned against communities that exploit empathic sensitivity through guilt, shame, or spiritual superiority. These toxic groups often masquerade as healing spaces, while actually feeding off empaths' energy and emotional labor. They discourage boundary development, promote spiritual bypassing, and maintain members' dependency rather than supporting their growth towards psychological sovereignty. Jung emphasized that empaths often need professional guidance from therapists who understand energy work, not just traditional talk therapy approaches that may dismiss or pathologize their sensitivity. Effective therapists for empaths understand both psychological dynamics and energetic processes, helping empaths develop practical skills for managing their sensitivity while honoring its value. The transformation stages, from victim to alchemist. Jung mapped 5 predictable phases empaths experience during conscious integration. Crisis recognition typically follows a breakdown where absorption patterns nearly destroy the empath's psychological or physical health. This crisis forces acknowledgement that their sensitivity has become self-destructive. Jung noted that this crisis often manifests as what appears to be a nervous breakdown, chronic illness, or complete emotional exhaustion. The empath system finally collapses under the weight of carrying everyone else's psychological material. Common triggers include major relationship endings where they realize they've been carrying their partner's emotions for years, workplace burnout from absorbing colleagues' stress, or family crises where their role as emotional caretaker becomes unsustainable. The crisis serves a crucial function. It forces empaths to acknowledge that their current approach isn't sustainable. Jung called this the dark night of the empath soul, a necessary shattering that precedes rebirth. Boundary archaeology involves learning to distinguish personal emotional states from absorbed material, developing practices for energetic clearing, and establishing protection protocols for high-risk social situations. This stage requires empaths to become emotional detectives, investigating their inner landscape to determine what actually belongs to them. Jung developed specific exercises. Empaths spend time in complete isolation to establish their baseline emotional state, then gradually reintroduce social contact while monitoring changes. They learn to ask, "How did I feel before entering this room? What shifted during the interaction? What am I carrying that isn't mine?" The archaeology process often reveals shocking discoveries. Empaths realize they've been living other people's lives, carrying inherited family trauma, or operating from absorbed beliefs that contradict their authentic values. Archetypal dialogue requires confronting the psychological forces that have been possessing them, transforming unconscious compulsions into conscious choices about when and how to engage in healing work. Jung taught empaths to visualize and directly communicate with archetypal forces like the wounded healer or eternal mother. Through active imagination, they negotiate new terms. I will serve healing, but not at the cost of my well-being. I will offer compassion, but I won't absorb others' pain as my own. This stage often involves intense inner work, as empaths confront their addiction to being needed, their fear of abandonment if they stop rescuing others, and their identity confusion when they're not defined by others' problems. Identity reclamation means excavating their authentic personality from beneath layers of absorbed projections, reconnecting with their own desires, preferences, and life direction. Jung compared this to archaeological restoration, carefully removing foreign material to reveal the original artifact underneath. Empaths must rediscover their authentic preferences, what they genuinely enjoy versus what they think they should enjoy, their real emotions, what they actually feel versus what they've absorbed, and their true desires, what they want versus what others want from them. This reclamation often requires grieving the false self they've maintained for years and courage to disappoint others who prefer them in their absorbed, depleted state. Conscious service represents empaths who use their sensitivity as a refined tool for healing while maintaining complete psychological integrity and energetic sovereignty. Jung described this final stage as empathic mastery. Empaths who can feel deeply, offer genuine healing, and serve others' well-being without losing themselves in the process. They've learned to channel their sensitivity through conscious intention rather than unconscious compulsion. These integrated empaths become what Jung called conscious vessels. They can hold space for others' pain without absorbing it, offer healing from strength rather than depletion, and serve collective transformation without sacrificing their individual wholeness. Jung noted that this transformation often takes years and requires sustained commitment to inner work, but results in empaths who become powerful forces for healing rather than casualties of their own sensitivity. Integration. Hazards, transformation traps. Even during conscious development, empaths face specific pitfalls that can derail their integration process. The spiritual superiority trap occurs when empaths use their sensitivity to maintain superiority over less evolved people, avoiding the humbling work of psychological development. Jung warned that newly awakened empaths often develop what he called enlightenment pride, believing their sensitivity makes them more spiritually advanced than others. They begin judging people who set boundaries as cold or unfeeling, and those who don't absorb others' pain as unconscious or selfish. This superiority becomes a defense against doing their own inner work. Instead of examining their absorption patterns, they frame them as spiritual gifts. Instead of developing boundaries, they dismiss boundary setting as spiritual regression. Jung noted that this trap actually prevents genuine development by reinforcing the very patterns that need transformation. The boundary rigidity trap involves swinging to the opposite extreme, becoming so protected that they lose their empathic gifts entirely and disconnect from their natural sensitivity. Some empaths, once they discover boundaries, become obsessed with protection. They build walls so high that nothing can penetrate, neither toxic material nor genuine connection. Jung observed empaths who went from being completely porous to becoming emotionally numb, cutting themselves off from the very sensitivity that makes them valuable healers. This overcorrection often stems from terror of returning to their previous overwhelmed state. But Jung emphasized that healthy boundaries are membranes, not walls. They filter rather than block, allowing conscious choice about what to absorb and what to deflect. The rescue relapse trap happens when empaths feel guilty about their new boundaries and return to old absorption patterns, believing they're being selfish by protecting their energy. Jung documented how family members, friends, and romantic partners often resist empaths' boundary development, consciously or unconsciously, pressuring them to return to their previous role as emotional caretakers. Comments like, "You've become so cold," or "You're not the caring person I used to know," trigger guilt and self-doubt. The empath's identity has been so tied to being helpful that setting boundaries feels like betraying their essential nature. Jung noted that this guilt is often the final test. Empaths must choose between others' comfort and their own psychological integrity. The isolation perfectionism trap leads empaths to withdraw completely from relationships, rather than learning to navigate them consciously, using spiritual development as an excuse for avoiding intimacy. Some empaths become so focused on maintaining their energy that they avoid meaningful connections entirely. They justify isolation as self-care or spiritual practice. But Jung recognized this as another form of imbalance, using boundaries to avoid the challenging work of conscious relationship. True integration requires learning to maintain sensitivity while engaging meaningfully with others, not hiding from human connection in the name of protection. Jung emphasized that empaths' gifts are meant to serve relationship and community, not isolation and withdrawal. The collective function, Healing the wounded world. Jung believed that conscious empaths serve humanity's psychological evolution by becoming bridges between individual healing and collective transformation. These integrated empaths can process collective shadow material without being destroyed, helping transform cultural trauma, inherited family patterns, and archetypal wounds that affect entire communities. Jung observed that humanity faces psychological challenges that require individuals capable of feeling collective pain without being overwhelmed by it. Cultural shadow processing represents empaths' most crucial evolutionary function. Jung recognized that societies, like individuals, develop shadow material, rejected aspects of collective consciousness that get projected onto marginalized groups or enemy nations. Conscious empaths can feel these collective shadows without being possessed by them, helping societies recognize and integrate their disowned aspects. Jung documented how empaths throughout history have served as cultural healing agents, shamans who absorbed tribal trauma and transformed it into wisdom, artists who channeled collective pain into transformative expression, and healers who processed communal wounds that individuals couldn't bear alone. Intergenerational trauma. Healing occurs when conscious empaths learn to process inherited family patterns without perpetuating them. Jung observed that traumatic experiences create psychological imprints that pass through family lines until someone develops the consciousness to transform them. Empaths often carry multi-generational trauma in their psychic field. Wars their grandparents survived, abuse their parents endured, systemic oppression their ancestors experienced. When empaths remain unconscious, they simply pass these traumas to the next generation. But conscious empaths can serve as family healers, processing inherited pain and preventing its transmission. Social transformation catalyst function emerges when empaths use their sensitivity to identify and transform toxic cultural patterns. They feel the psychological cost of social injustice, environmental destruction, and collective disconnection in ways that motivate meaningful action. Jung believed that conscious empaths become society's early warning system. They feel the psychological consequences of cultural problems before they manifest as widespread social breakdown. Their sensitivity allows them to identify where healing is needed and mobilize resources for transformation. They demonstrate that sensitivity and strength aren't opposites, that empathy can be a superpower when combined with psychological mastery, and that healing others doesn't require sacrificing yourself. Most importantly, they model a new way of being, individuals who can feel the world's pain without drowning in it, who can offer genuine healing without losing themselves in the process. Consciousness evolution. Leadership represents empaths' highest collective function. Jung envisioned conscious empaths as pioneers of psychological integration, demonstrating how to maintain individual sovereignty while serving collective well-being. These empaths become living examples of what Jung called individuated compassion, deep caring that enhances rather than diminishes personal wholeness. They show others that it's possible to be deeply sensitive without being chronically overwhelmed, to serve healing without becoming martyrs, and to feel collective pain without losing personal boundaries. Jung believed that as more empaths achieve conscious integration, they create a field of possibility that makes it easier for others to develop healthy sensitivity. They become cultural templates for psychological maturity, showing humanity how to evolve beyond the false choice between numbing out or burning out. The alchemical choice. Jung's warning reveals empathy's double-edged nature. It's either your greatest vulnerability or your most powerful gift, depending entirely on whether you remain unconscious or develop mastery over your absorption patterns. The darkness isn't empathy itself, but the unconscious processes that transform sensitive people into psychological dumping grounds for collective shadow material. Your overwhelm isn't weakness. It's evidence you've been carrying burdens that were never yours to bear. Your empathic sensitivity represents advanced psychological equipment that most people don't possess. But without proper integration, this gift becomes a curse that gradually erases your identity and autonomy. Jung's path transforms unconscious absorption into conscious alchemy. You learn to witness suffering without becoming contaminated by it, to serve healing from strength rather than sacrifice, and to use your sensitivity as a precision tool rather than an uncontrolled flood. The world needs empaths who have completed this integration, individuals capable of feeling collective pain without drowning, offering genuine healing without self-destruction, and modeling psychological sovereignty for others trapped in unconscious absorption patterns. If you recognize yourself struggling with empathic absorption, comment, "I choose conscious empathy." Your sensitivity isn't your curse. When properly developed, it becomes humanity's medicine. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.